very quickly, because time is short, Kenneth Marcus will be speaking today. The title of the lecture is Antisemitism and Racism, Confronting Jew Hatred at American Universities. Kenneth Marcus is currently the Lillian Nathan Ackerman Visiting Professor of Equality and Justice at Baruch College School of Public Affairs at the City University of New York. He's also a Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Jewish and Community Research. He's an author of many books and articles, important ones, and I think also he was well known in the past for being the staff director of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, and he was credited, and I think accurately so, by the Wall Street Journal, to have taken an agency from disarray that lacked basic management controls and turned it into an agency that deserves, and I quote, deserves a medal for good governance, and I think it's very true. And he was known throughout the community of human rights and people dealing with issues of anti-Semitism to take the Department of Civil Rights and deal with issues of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and really made it into an active, effective agency. So it's really a pleasure that you're here. We were also schoolmates, also with Annette, at the U.S. Holocaust Museum this summer, so it's really nice to welcome you here. Finally.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I've been talking with Charles for quite some time about making this happen, and I'm very, very pleased that we could. Again, I'm sorry on behalf of myself and Amtrak for the late start. But thrilled by the opportunity to speak with you about a question that I have wrestled with now for about 5 years. And it is, rather bluntly, the question as to whether anti-Semitism should be considered to be a form of racism. That's the question generally, but as you may know from my paper, I look at the question in a very specific context, and it's the context of American civil rights law, and even more specifically the context of a very specific civil rights statute, namely Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, the context in which I began asking the question was trying to deal with a gap, what occurred to me to be a gap in civil rights law. When I first joined the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, before I got there, I figured, well, I've got to find out what this place does. I looked at their website, and I immediately thought, how embarrassing. There's a mistake that the webmaster made that I'm going to have to bring to his attention. He listed the different bases of discrimination that the agency deals with, and he mentions race, color, national origin, sex, disability, age, and even membership in patriotic youth organizations, and he missed religion. Now, how do you miss religion? It's central. It's right there in the First Amendment. Race, color, creed, or race, color, religion is in all of the civil rights laws going back to executive orders from FDR and Truman. It certainly is within various parts of the Civil Rights Act of 64, the 68 Act, and other legislation. I would find a subtle way of, sort of a face-saving way of pointing out gently that the website missed. And of course, it was not an error. At least it was an error on the webmaster's part. The fact is, and this is really a long story, but the fact is, we never did, as a country, prohibit religious discrimination in federally assisted educational institutions. And there's a long history of it, and a lot of questions about whether we should or whether we shouldn't. But the fact is that in 1964, when the Congress dealt with the bill that had come to it from the Kennedy administration originally, they took out the word religion from only one part of the very lengthy piece of legislation, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They kept it in Title VII, which deals with employment discrimination, and kept it elsewhere, but they took it out from the Title VI, which deals with education, it deals with health and human services, it deals with transportation. So, Office for Civil Rights deals with discrimination in education, but not religious discrimination. So I thought, well, I wonder what they do about Jews. And that's the question that I've been dealing with since. Now, to give a little bit more background to how I dealt with it, I joined OCR in 2002. 2002 was a rather disturbing year for anti-Semitism in higher education. I know I'm dealing now with people with far greater expertise than I am, so you may know in more detail that during the year 2002 there was a wave of reported incidents which was far greater than we had seen in prior years on college campuses. It was in April 2002 that a now notorious flyer was distributed throughout the San Francisco State campus that had a, forgive me, I'll be explicit, a large photograph of a dead baby, and under it were emblazoned the words, Palestinian baby meat slaughtered by Jewish right according to American license, or something along those lines. Rather explicit reference or reiteration of the blood libel, used in a way that was clearly political and yet at the same time also clearly anti-Semitic and racial. Within a month of that, there was, on that same campus, an incident in which a peace rally went bad. Are you familiar with this? On San Francisco State, May of, some yes, some no, May of 2002. Shortly after that flyer was distributed, there was a peace rally. A number of people spoke about peace between Israel and Palestine. One elderly Russian Jewish man got up to speak poignantly about how glad he was after years of persecution in the Soviet Union that he was in a place where Jews were not subject to that sort of thing. The rally ended. The 300 or so people mostly left until there were only a very small number of Jewish students and faculty who were left. And at that point, the counter-protest, which had been building in its intensity, got so great with cries of F the Jews, die racist pigs, and so on and so forth. Get out or we will kill you. By this point, the mom started to scream. Hitler did not finish the job, yelling epithets and threats of this sort until the police had to take the remaining Jewish members of the group and essentially march them to their safety to the Hillel, an incident that was something of a wake-up call for those of us who thought that anti-Semitism was no longer the problem that it had once been on American college campuses. Not long after that, maybe a year and a half after that, the David Project released the film Columbia Unbecoming. Some of you are familiar with that. It documented incidents involving the so-called MILAC department, the Middle Eastern Studies program within Columbia University, and especially conflicts between Middle Eastern Studies faculty and pro-Israel Jewish students, where Jewish students essentially argued that they had been silenced or that their views suppressed in some way or other. In one memorable incident, a professor in the middle of a class articulated his view that Palestinians had a prior claim to the land of Israel. Not in and of itself a notable remark, but after that remark, he got into a kind of a dispute with a student. And as she relates it on the film, their argument in class led to a discussion outside of class. They walked together outside, having a rather intense conversation. And when he drew me outside of the classroom, he said to me, "You have no voice in this debate." And she said, "Of course I'm allowed to express my opinion." To which he responded, "Look, you have green eyes. You are not a Semite. I'm a Semite. I have brown eyes. You have no claim to the land of Israel." Close quote. So we had at this point, 2002, 2003, 2004, a number of incidents starting to be of high profile in which it appeared that there was a problem of anti-Semitism on college campuses greater than what had appeared before. 2004. 2004, I spoke to the staff at Office for Civil Rights, or issued memos to them, and I made it clear that if there were cases involving groups that had either any sort of religious aspect to them as well as non-religious, I would like to know about any religious claims coming in. Because at the time, if you said to an official in the San Francisco or New York office of the Office for Civil Rights, I'm a Jewish student and I've been harassed, the response would be, I'm sorry to hear that, there's nothing we can do. You're Jewish, that's a religion. That's a religion, and we have no jurisdiction over religious discrimination. Now, if you had said, I'm an Arab Muslim and I've been harassed, they would say, pull up a chair, let's talk about that. Islam is a religion, we have no jurisdiction, but Arab is a national origin, and if there's any way that we can find that your discrimination was at least in part on the basis of national origin, then you may have a claim. So I got a case involving a man who said my 12-year-old son was beaten up and called Osama because of his Sikh faith. This was in New Jersey. The New York office dutifully sent it to me. It was a case that would have been dismissed out of hand, but they knew that I was interested. Would have been dismissed after all the father had said it was on the basis of his Sikh faith. My observation in the first place was the legal basis, whether religion, national origin, race, or so on and so forth, is a matter of law for us to decide, and the witness testimony can only tell us about the fact, not the legal characterization. But Sikhism, whether it is purely a religion or whether it has other characteristics which might qualify for protection, is actually a subtle question. And I ended up directing an investigation and giving the guidance that for Sikhs, as for Jews, as for other groups, if there are characteristics, whether of common dress or language or geographical origins, which may be ethnic or ancestral in character, we will assert race or national origin jurisdiction, whether or not that group also has a religious character. The religious character of a particular group will not prevent us from asserting jurisdiction. So that led to a policy that I issued, which was done in the context of the Sikh faith, but which in my mind I knew was probably going to be more applicable in the case of the antisemitism that we saw increasingly around the country. Well, no sooner did I issue this new policy, it was an informal policy, saying that we would deal with mixed issues for groups that have both ethnic and religious characteristics. Then we got a blunderbuss of a complaint, a massive lengthy complaint of the sort I've seen very few of. NAACP occasionally will come up with complaints of the detail and specificity. It came from an organization that I had not been familiar with as a civil rights organization. It came from the Center for Law and Justice of the Zionist Organization of America. And they detailed a lengthy series of incidents on the campus of the University of California at Irvine. Some of you familiar with the Irvine matter, some of you are. Some of you are. So you may know that by now it has become a rather notorious situation on that campus. ZOA was able, through the work of attorney Susan Tuckman, to document a substantial pattern of anti-Semitic incidents over a period of years, and what they alleged to be inadequate response by the administration at Irvine. It ranged from rock throwing and stonking to death threats to destruction of a Holocaust memorial to destruction of personal property, yelling and screaming. It did involve words, but the words were in various sorts of settings, lectures on campus where people would talk about there are good Jews and there are bad Jews. They would frequently in these talks castigate Israel and Zionists. In some cases, Zionism was clearly thinly veiled allusion to Jews. In some cases, they would just talk about Jews and criticize Jews. So we had a fairly lengthy pattern and opened an investigation. Well, long story short, the biggest part of that case was dismissed after my departure by my successor, who took a narrower view of what it means for the government to prohibit discrimination on the basis of race or national origin. About a year or so ago, in a matter that's still technically on appeal, and which the Obama administration will likely have to address, the Office for Civil Rights said that all of this stuff, some of it's time barred, some of it wasn't sufficiently backed by evidence, but the rest of it simply did not amount to discrimination on the basis of national origin. They looked very carefully to see whether discrimination was specifically alleged by Jewish students who are of Israeli origin, but other than the question of whether Israeli students might have Israeli national origin discrimination, OCR didn't even address the race discrimination issue. Didn't address it at all. Just ignored it. And ignored it, I think, most likely for the two reasons for which OCR had been rejecting these cases all the way up until 2004 when they issued the policy. The first was what I mentioned before, which is that Congress had an opportunity to prohibit religious discrimination, and it deliberately took the word religion out from Title VI. And OCR did not want to exceed its jurisdictional boundaries by enforcing something which it didn't have the power to enforce. But second, because OCR believed that Jews are not a race, and that it would be inappropriate to characterize Jews as a race. And that is the reason why I think up until 2004, and since 2006, OCR has essentially rejected complaints of anti-Semitic harassment by Jewish students. Now, I think they're wrong. I think that's wrong for perhaps as many as four reasons. Now, there was one reason that I articulated in 2004 when I was at OCR, and a few others which I've taken the opportunity of writing this paper and speaking here to flesh out a little bit. The one reason that I used when I was at OCR was historical. It was based on the intent of Congress. And I used that reason because it was a legal structure that had been adopted in analogous situations by the Supreme Court. 20 years before, the Supreme Court had asked almost the same question. They had asked, are Jews a race? And they asked it in a civil rights context, but it was in the context of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. There was a synagogue called Shari Tefillah in Silver Spring. Any familiar? Probably less familiar with this situation, so one or two of you are familiar. So you know that about 20 years ago, there was a series of acts of vandalism against Shari Tefillah Synagogue in Silver Spring. And the question came up, what do we do about it? The congregation sued the alleged vandals, saying that this was a violation of the Old Civil Rights Act, and we should get damages. It deprived us of our use of property based on race. Well, that was a controversial situation. Does the synagogue really want to say that we have faced discrimination on the basis of race? The district court rejected the argument, saying Jews aren't a race. And the Court of Appeals also rejected the argument, saying Jews are not a race. And because Jews are not a race, they should not be able to avail themselves of the civil rights law. Now, interestingly, at almost the same time, there was a professor who was denied tenure at a university, and he said that it was because he was married. And he sued under the same statute. Where national origin discrimination wasn't good enough, he had to prove that he was discriminated against on the basis of race. And there, the trial court had no problem saying that Arabs were a race. And the Court of Appeals had no problem saying that Arabs were a race. So at the same time, coming up to the Supreme Court were two cases, one saying that Arabs are a race, the other saying that Jews aren't. So they had to address that question. The organized Jewish communities, when the congregation first brought its case, were slow to champion its cause. But as the case worked its way through the system, at least a few of them made the argument that if a bigot discriminates against Jews on the basis of race, then that's racism, and it should be enough to constitute discrimination on the basis of race. That had actually convinced one of the judges in the Court of Appeals, but it was a dissenting judge. When it got to the Supreme Court said, we're going to affirm that Arabs are a race. We're going to reverse on the Jewish case. We're going to say Jews are a race. We're not going to adopt the argument made by the congregation and by the Jewish organizations that subjective intent matters, that the question is whether the bigot was acting based on a mistaken prejudice, because we, the Supreme Court, don't believe that that's what was prohibited. What was prohibited is racial discrimination, not mistaken racial discrimination. But the court said Jews are a race. Jews are a race very specifically within the meaning of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Because and these are conservative judges using the theory of original intent, saying that in the theory of original intent, if you ask what did Congress mean in 1866 when it prohibited racial discrimination, Jews were actually mentioned, and so were Arabs and lots of other groups, because the idea of race was so broad in 1866 that it included Jews. So the court said that what we need to do is ask what was meant by Congress in 1866, and how would it be understood by the public in 1866. And based on that, we say that to this day, under that particular statute, Jews are a race. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was to have the legal support behind me of the Supreme Court as a government official, and to say I was simply applying federal law as decided by the Supreme Court. Now, for most of the people I talked to, they said, well, no, it goes the other way. Under that precedent, Jews are not a race under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because the logic of that decision is that you need to ask what was the intent of Congress in 1964, and how was the word race understood by the public in 1964. And just as race had a broad meaning in 1866, it had a relatively narrow meaning in 1964. And by 1964, most people didn't think Jews were a race, and most Jews didn't consider themselves to be members of a distinct race. And that's been the case since the Second World War. And that, I think, had been essentially the consensus view of how you interpret the Supreme Court case, Shara-Tefila versus Cobb, to the 64 Act. But the point that I made at that time, and my first point about whether antisemitism is racism, is that to faithfully apply original intent, you have to ask what did Congress mean in 1964. And what Congress meant in 1964 was not to create a new set of rights dealing with race discrimination, which we have to interpret under 64 racial understandings. What Congress intended in 1964, and this is very clear from the floor debate, and in other contexts it's been recognized by the Supreme Court as well, what Congress wanted to do in 1964 was to create an enforcement system that would realize the set of rights that were established in the 1860s. In other words, what Congress was saying is that we are not creating or changing any rights or altering any rights. We are just creating a way of enforcing the rights that already exist. So the rights that already existed in 1866 are the rights that are enforced under the 64 Act. And for that reason, and this is the policy that officially is still on the books at OCR, the 1964 Act should be understood to protect those same rights as broadly as they were interpreted by the Supreme Court against race discrimination within the meaning that was first established in the 1860s. Now, I believe that that is a solid historical legal interpretation of the 64 Congress's intent and the 1866 Congress's intent. But as I went back to this to try to expand the analysis, it occurs to me that this whole structure, this whole analytical structure is only as good as the current Supreme Court. That when we get new members, say with a new president who may have the opportunity to, the whole methodology of originalism is less likely to continue in force in the future. And we have to ask, what are the different ways of addressing a question which a different sort of court might ask if it is not bound by originalist theory, which the conservative members of the current court adhere to. After all, the originalist theory has various problems, particularly in the context of this situation. I mean, think about it, it's true that this methodology, this way of looking at the issue, has led to protections for Jews in the Shari Tefillah case, and can lead to protections, I believe, for college students in an Irvine type case. On the other hand, there is at best a certain awkwardness to solidifying the 19th century notions of race and basing 21st century jurisprudence on our ideas of what race were in the 1860s, which are rejected by essentially everybody, by the public, by scientists, by everyone else. There is at least a certain peculiarity to allowing that to continue to be the foundation for rights against anti-Semitism in educational institutions. So I've looked at it in I'd say, three other ways. Since the court in Shari Tefillah most conspicuously said, we'll look at the history and congressional intent rather than what modern scientific theory says, it occurs to me that one has to at least be ready to address the question, what does modern scientific theory say about it? And I'm just going to quickly go over this piece. It's a complicated one. I think that for many people the answer is obvious. For many people the answer is obvious, which is that if you want to look at modern science, Jews are not a race. And there are any number of different statements of this in the literature. Jews are obviously not a race because race is a biological designation, is one classical formulation of this. And I think that that's a commonly held popular view for why Jews can't be considered a race. It proves too much, though, of course, because race as a biological designation is an essentially discredited notion. Jews are not a race, it seems to me, for largely the same reason that nobody else is either, which is to say that the notion of race no longer has any sort of scientific validity within either the natural or the social sciences. But where does that get you? Does that get you to the point that nobody should have protection against race discrimination? Well, it may get you to the conclusion that this isn't the right way of looking at it, maybe. I'll just very quickly say, although I discussed it a little bit greater length in the paper, that to accept the notion that race is a social construct is not necessarily to foreclose the question as to whether Jews are a race within the sense of social construction. That is to say, it is at least a coherent question as to whether Jews in general, or Ashkenazic Jews, or light-skinned Ashkenazic Jews, however you want to frame the question, there's at least a coherent question as to whether American Jews have been racialized as a distinct population group such that they should have protection under the civil rights laws. And I think that it is a subtle and difficult one, which could be argued either way, and we can talk about it a little bit later if you would like to. But what I would say is that the obvious answer is clearly wrong. It is not obvious whether or not one would consider Jews to be a distinct race if one is looking at social construction only. The third is to ask about public meaning, general public meaning. Under the notion that as society evolves, our legal concepts change, and courts should not be stuck in 18th century or 19th century ideas about whether it's race, whether it's due process, whether it's about speech, whether it's about press, whether it's about punishment or search and seizure, that we have evolving notions of justice, and we should use contemporary concepts to flesh out the terms of the Constitution or statutes. So if one were to ask, well, what is the general public meaning? What is our general public understanding? Well, there again, I think that there might be an obvious answer to that, and it might also be wrong, just as there were obvious answers to the first two parts, which are also wrong. For the Jewish community, if you ask the question, are Jews a race? Not necessarily anthropologists or geneticists, but Jewish community, are Jews Jews a race, they're a religion, both race, religion, so on and so forth. I think you will get very few people who say a race, virtually none. On the other hand, you will get a very large number of people who do not say Jews are just a religion, who will say either that Jews are an ethnicity, or that Jews are both an ethnicity and a religion, if those are the options. And I know there's research that's will be coming out shortly, which demonstrates that both for the Jewish community, the non-Jewish community, and also specifically for college faculty, that the greatest single answer is both religion and ethnicity. Well, in this context, one thing that I'm going to say about it is that race has been defined in contemporary jurisprudence as being a shared ethnic or ancestral characteristics. And if the question is, do members of the public generally or the Jewish community believe that the Jewish people have shared ethnic or ancestral characteristics, I think that there is at least a basis for the answer that yes. Those are, I would say, three ways of asking the question, are Jews a race? In order to answer the question, should anti-Semitism be considered to be a form of racism? The best way of answering the question, though, I think, is not to ask, are Jews a race? But rather, is anti-Semitism a form of racism? Which is, like the dissent in the Shari Tefillah case, a way of saying that we should look at subjective intent, asking not so much, or at least not exclusively, what is the character of the victim who claims protection, but asking what is the nature of the bigotry faced by the Jewish people. Now, that too opens up a series of questions, but I think that is the best ground on which the question should be addressed. Now, at this point, I think we could go in a lot of different directions, but I'd certainly love to hear comments or questions.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So we can open it up. We have about half an hour.
I think that, especially since the Nazi era, which started before the Nazis came to power, the whole notion of anti-Semitism as a religious notion it became passé. And what we refer today to as the new racism is essentially based on notions that the Nazis had propagated. You examine the kind of cartoons. None of them deals with religious issues. All of them are with ethnic, which we can refer to as racial. Whether they're children of monkeys or any other description that is included in those cartoons. So, as you refer to the end, it's more important how the anti-Semite practice the anti-Semitism, not what we consider ourselves to be. We might consider ourselves to be part of a group of people. Some may consider to be just part of a religion, but that is immaterial. What's more important is that how the anti-Semites perceive us. And they perceive us today, the anti-Semitism is ethnical, not religious.
Thank you. I think that fleshed out what I was saying at the end.
In regard to biology and race, I think you must have read the recent report from Spain about the testing of DNA of some sample. I think it was 1,000 Spaniards, and the report stated that checking the DNA that the 20% of that sample were Jews, Sephardic Jews. So, unless this is fiction, there certainly are some scientists who are making the DNA connection Jewry. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah. There's actually a section in my paper that I didn't have time to cover here where I address that as part of the second of the four arguments. The first is historical and the second is scientific.
Yeah.
And going over scientific, I think that if one is looking at contemporary science, one has to look mostly at contemporary race theory and the social construction of race. But for purposes of conclusion, I think one has to recognize that there is at least a growing minority, particularly among geneticists, to a lesser extent among social scientists, who accept that there may be certain genetic commonalities among large numbers of Jews, and one sees it in different sorts of studies about both looking at Ashkenazic and Sephardic, looking at commonalities to find that there are some genetic qualities that are very disproportionately held by Jews and less so with non-Jews, except in the Middle East, where one sees a greater intermixture. I do think that's a useful part of the picture, and what I take from that is that even if one were to look at contemporary population genetics rather than anthropology as a source for identifying what does modern science say about the situation, there too, the argument that Jews are a race is probably as strong as the argument that anybody else is a race.
If I can make some comments. So following up what you said, so I agree. So if race is a social construction, I actually did my research on social construction, identity, and race. And as a footnote, I didn't grow up in the United States, so coming to the United States, I always find it kind of humorous, in a way, that many Jewish people here consider themselves to be white, given that I would say that whiteness is more of sort of a historical category, which Jews were certainly not considered a part of and actually paid a tremendous price for not being a part of. So growing up in Canada, and I think European Jews, we would consider ourselves to be Jewish. And I don't think necessarily as a race, but being Jewish. I mean, white people in Canada were people from England and France. Those were the white people, and the rest of us were others. So it is a social construction, and given Jewish history, when Jews were considered to be Semitic, they paid the price, and now in the United States they are considered by many Jews and others to be white. And it's interesting, I think, how the notion of whiteness expands in the United States historically. So even I think Italians and Spanish people at some point in time were not considered white either. That whiteness is expanding for all sorts of reasons, and maybe perhaps because of migration from South America and all sorts of reasons, the notion of whiteness expands. But my question in terms of anti-Semitism, as anti-Semitism becomes more and more linked to Zionism in the state of Israel, is there room in the American legal system, because the kids at Columbia University or at Irvine or San Francisco State University were attacked in part because they were aligned with Israel, or being perceived as supporters of Israel. So even though they're American citizens and their origin is not Israeli, they're being labeled as supporters of a national origin or part of a national origin. Is there room in the legal system to sort of call this a form of discrimination?
Yes, and let me hit that first, and I want to swing back to the other. Now, for those of us who think that the primary way of addressing the question is subjective intent, asking, is the anti-Semitic person driven by racial misunderstandings rather than asking our Jews race? For those of us who say we want to go the way of subjective intent, here's the rub. Here's the rub. If you look what's actually happening on college campuses and ask, what are the alleged discriminators saying and doing, they will very seldom use explicit statements that connect them up with any sort of racism, explicit racism. They will sometimes. In the Sharon Tefillah case, you had people with Ku Klux Klanish comments and symbols and statements that they were making. It was easier to see that these were old-fashioned bigots who clearly had a racial misunderstanding of Jews. But if you're on the campus of San Francisco State or Irvine or Wayne State or Columbia or somewhere else, you are less likely to hear anything that sounds explicitly explicitly racist. You will hear a lot about Israel. You will hear a lot about Zionism. And so the surrounding evidence, the surrounding circumstances say political. They don't say religious, but they may not say racial as much as they say political. So the question is, does it has to be racial intent? Well, oftentimes it's going to be hard to find racial intent. Now, we know that this is not limited to anti-Semitism because we know that this is a characteristic generally true of the new racism, which is to say that if one wants to find whether there's racism in the denial of employment to an African American or different sorts of harassment or discrimination against Hispanics, racial intent is almost always hidden. It's almost always hidden because of the stigma associated with it. It's hidden whether one is talking about African Americans or Jews. So it's going to be often a very difficult case to make. There is sometimes, however, surrounding evidence that you can look to. The cartoons, for instance, will have clearly racial or biological characteristics. So if an incident takes place within an environment where there's enough surrounding circumstances, you will often find statements made, pictures, things that link it. I believe that generally speaking, the phenomenon is not exclusively or even largely political. It's a phenomenon that carries with it much of the old racial baggage, and it even carries within it many of the stereotypes and defamations from long before the Nazi era. So the trick, though, is to find that. But in environments, in hostile environments where you have a lot of anti-Jewish stuff going on, you will very frequently find people make comments about Jews that clearly are at least partly racial in character. The harder thing is when you just have one person beats up another. How do you know what the intent is? OCR clearly was not up to the task in the Irvine case. In the Irvine case, the fascinating investigation took place largely after my departure. One thing that was interesting about the case is that the investigators actually went on campus at Irvine to hear what was going on themselves. And this was unique in my recollection, is that in many cases the investigators were not merely reporting what they were told by others. In many cases the investigators would actually be at Irvine and they would hear with their own ears the most horrible anti-Semitic rants being made on that campus. And the OCR closure letter rejected the case, which is now on appeal, admitted that much of this was offensive to Jewish students at Irvine. But OCR concludes that it was on the basis of a political conviction rather than on the basis of national origin. Now, I've explained why I think it's a mistake just to ask the national origin. You also have to ask the race and national origin. But that still doesn't answer this question from Charles, which is it really on the basis of race, national origin, or religion broadly construed when it looks like it's just about religion? Now, that's another paper unto itself. But in a word, my view is that racial anti-Semitism didn't come out of nowhere, and Bill Maher didn't all of a sudden cut out everything that came before it. That the stereotypes and defamations of religious were then integrated with it. And in the same way, the political includes the other, to the extent that all of these, or many of these anti-Semitic statements that were heard by the investigators, while made in a political context, had clearly racial and ethnic themes to them. And to the extent that there are racial and ethnic themes bound up with political or religious or anything else, it seems to me that is at least in part within the rubric of ethnic or ancestral discrimination. One last thing on your first point. I do think that the question of whiteness is really a fascinating issue. I agree with you that it is much more complicated than sort of the stereotypical issue is, and that the resolution of that question is certainly closely related to the question of what is anti-Semitism.
The hate crimes laws in this country take into consideration subjective intent. When I worked for the Anti-Defamation League, I was involved with this issue in developing and giving out hate crimes cards to all the police in Connecticut. And it specifies that if someone is to be arrested for a hate crime, if someone assaults you because he thinks you are Jewish, or he thinks you are black, or he thinks you are gay, and you're not, it doesn't matter, because it was the intent of the person who assaulted you that would get him arrested and could get him charged with a hate crime, which has extra punitive measures attached to it. So it doesn't matter. I mean, if somebody who was not Jewish dressed up in a Hasidic costume and walked on the streets and had eggs thrown at him, that's a hate crime, even if the person isn't Jewish, because the intent was to harm somebody because he was perceived to be Jewish.
Yes and no. Yes and no.
That's definitely the case with the hate crime statute here in this country.
What you say is true, but it's a little more subtle. It's a little more subtle than that. The question came up in the Crown Heights case. The Crown Heights case where the victim said, or his family said, it was because he was beaten because during the riot it was hate on the basis of race. The whole law that was being used as the basis for the lawsuit was a subjective intent statute. But the question was subjective intent to harass this person on the basis of what? On the basis of race. Well, what is race? And the statute asks about the subjective intent of what was his name? Lemrick? Okay. It asked about this. It was all about the subjective intent, but it was still a question for the court as to what subjective intent mattered. If you certainly had to prove that there was a subjective intent to harm the victim on the basis of race. Yes, you had to prove that there was objective intent to harm the person on the basis of race. But the question still remained, if there was a subjective intent to harm the person on the grounds that he was Jewish, was that a subjective intent to harm the person on the basis of race or not?
Religion is protected in terms of the hate crime laws, unlike what you're describing on college campuses. Another thing, the issue on college campuses, and we face this at the Anti-Defamation League, is the right of free speech. And so somebody could be arrested under the hate crimes laws if he assaulted you because he thought you were gay. But if he calls you a nasty epithet because he thinks that, he can't be arrested because it's not a crime that's committed, because it's free speech. And a lot of what goes on and is so anti-Semitic on the college campuses happens in the classroom or happens in extracurricular activities where the arguments on the part of the authorities on the campuses are that this is a matter of free speech and we don't squelch any kind of conversation on a college campus.
Yeah. Well, that issue comes up all the time when one talks about anti-Semitism. Occasionally when one talks about race, and never, or almost never, when one talks about other things, like gender. The selective use of the free speech argument on college campuses, I think, is one of the most salient aspects of the free speech issue.
I totally agree with that.
In the Irvine case, the administrators became, I would say, free speech absolutists in saying there's absolutely nothing that we can do when things are said and done on campus. They have an absolute right of free speech. Well, just a few months before that, there had been an affirmative action bake sale on that same campus. You know what I mean? Have an affirmative action bake. That's where, that's the sort of That's a protest by conservative groups where they sell cookies or brownies and they say it's $5 or it's $1 if you're white, it's 50 cents if you're black. As a way of illustrating the perceived unfairness of racial preferences. Well, Irvine very quickly stamped that out. Very quickly said, this protest has no place on campus, we will not let you do this. And almost immediately after, and without any sense of irony or inconsistency, said that you can write whatever you want on the Jewish posters and say whatever you want about Jews, and that's absolute free speech. I don't mean to belittle the importance of free speech protections, but I do think that the selective use with which they're applied is conspicuous. And I would say that the law on this is largely unsettled. It's largely unsettled. If the first case to go to the Supreme Court dealing with this issue involves anti-Semitism, I would say the court will have a very strong First Amendment opinion. If it deals with race, it's 50-50. And if it's sexual harassment, free speech protection, I think, at least based on what the lower courts have done, is less likely to be emphasized. Although, whichever way the court goes, will then be harmonized as among all of them, likely. In other words, there's no principled way of distinguishing free speech to harass women versus Hispanics versus blacks versus Jews. It has to be the same law. And yet, the way that they're dealt with, in fact, has been.
I'm curious how representative of how much issue there is in anti-Semitism on campus. You've given us several high-profile cases, and I'm wondering how pervasive is this, or is it isolated in a few places?
Well, that's an excellent question, and nobody has an answer. There are some who will say there are a few isolated, high-profile incidents, but that doesn't make a pattern, and that in general there's no big problem, just a few things going on. And others who will argue that anti-Semitism has become systemic in higher education and it's all over the place. We don't know how much there is. There's no real reliable federal record keeping. There was in the last Congress bill introduced that would marginally improve federal hate crimes record keeping, but not to the point where the government will be able to answer this question. Anti-Defamation League comes out with a number every year, which might be 80, which might be 90, which might be 100 or 105 incidents. And on the one hand, that may, in some respects, overcount because there might be very minor incidents that are included.
It's only the ones that are reported to the Anti-Defamation League.
Okay, let me finish the sentence. It may include minor incidents, and they might not be checked in the same way that the federal government might check them. On the other hand, as Marcia Stein says, thank you, it's only what's reported, and I believe that what's reported is a very tiny fraction of the total number. What's reported to the ADL doesn't include everything that's reported to every campus, and what's reported to every campus, I think, is a very small number. When I go on college campuses and ask students, have you seen or heard any incident that's anti-Semitic, I will invariably get a few hands that go up. Then when I press and give examples, I'll get some more hands that go up. Then when I say keep your hands up if you reported it to the ADL, or the hands start coming, or they haven't reported to anybody. So I would say that it's got to be a multiple of the number 100, but it's hard to say what it is. Now, what you make of this, suppose the number is 400 or 600. I still believe that it is a tiny fraction of the interactions that Jewish students have on campus. And I would characterize this as an excellent time to be Jewish on American college campuses, where there are far more incidents of philo-Semitism than anti-Semitism, where the great majority of college faculty and students do not harbor strong anti-Semitic feelings. So it's not the most pervasive aspect of college life. On the other hand, I would also say that there are a large enough number of incidents, including at least a handful of significant patterns, that it's a real problem that needs to be addressed. And, moreover, I think that the situation on American college campuses really needs to be understood in the context of what's going on around the world. And in history, to see that what one sees in a place like Irvine or San Francisco or Columbia is particularly disturbing when one sees the connections to what's happening in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere, because that's what makes us worry about, will it increase in number? Will it go beyond the college campus?
It's very interesting, and I think I can understand your perspective as social psychologist because I can really relate with in-group, out-group, and also the educational meaning of convicting someone with anti-Semitism. However, my history as a clinician in Israel, so we used to give evaluation for patients, sometimes which didn't really match. We only wanted them to get the treatment or to not get the diagnosis of schizophrenia, for example, because you take a person or on the other hand, you give them another evaluation for them to get the right treatment that they have. So my approach is like more pragmatic. So if you want to reduce or to avoid students to be harassed in college, what other options you have if you have this problem with racism, if it's a problem with the law? So what other options you have, like verbal violence, for example, or just harassment or violence in general? I mean, what ways used to resolve these problems, given the problems in the law now? I mean, so you just because of this problem in the law, I understand that there's no solution, and then students just get out without punishment. So, if I understand correctly, or you don't know.
Ultimately, I don't think the law is enough, although I do think the law can do a lot more than perhaps I expressed, because I do believe that Title VI prohibits virtually all the anti-Semitic discrimination and harassment in college campuses, and it's my hope that the Obama administration recognizes this and follows the policy that is in fact on the books. And if it does so, it has tools in place to ensure that college campuses are appropriately addressing anti-Semitism when it occurs. Now that's just one step. The federal government can do very little. The federal government will have at most a few cases. It will deal with it after the fact and when there's already a huge problem. But when the federal government is there in the background as a motivation, we will find that college administrators will start taking various actions to reduce the likelihood of these things happening. Okay? Pardon?
Grants. Granting, taking away grants and things and not making grants.
They can do that, and they can, whether it's with orientation, whether it's with training, whether it's appropriate supervision, so on and so forth. There are things that the university can do. Ultimately, that's only going to be the law can be a motivator to creating all sorts of systems on a campus, whether it's in terms of the supervision, whether it's in terms of the way manuals are written, whether it's in terms of orientation and training and so on and so forth. That's important. But ultimately, if you have people who are on campus who want to say this sort of thing, the ultimate solution to it isn't just training administrators to deal with these things when people want to say them or do them. It has to go beyond that, right? So ultimately, I think that you as a psychologist or people from other sorts of disciplinary backgrounds might have more to say with how you get to the problem, because the problem can be solved, it has to be before it gets to the campus. But I think that using the law and using higher education administration is a way of dealing with a problem that already exists, although ultimately the goal is to prevent the problem before it gets there. But that part of it is beyond mine.
But in the law, don't you have other options except for racism? For example, violence or harassment, or other options to define the problem, but in a different way, so the person who is guilty gets his punishment given the problem in the law.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily they don't necessarily work. I mean, if you look at all of the campuses where there have been incidents, and you ask the question, how many of these incidents, if true, are a violation of state and local criminal law, you'll find, well, lots of them are. But then if you ask, how many times has there been a prosecution, you'll find almost never. So there are lots of tools, but they're not usually used. And the point of the civil rights law is to provide a way of dealing with social problems that may be outlawed and may be criminalized, but that for various reasons are not being addressed properly.
So we have 3 minutes. So what I'd like to do is literally a very quick question and quick response. To Josh, and then the person, the gentleman beside you, and then Sharon. So very quickly, please.
Sure. It's not a question, well, maybe we would quickly address it, but if not, we can continue. It's along the lines of, you say law is something that can deal with a problem that already exists. But law also creates effects in the world, obviously. One criticism that one often hears about, for example, affirmative action and race-based laws is that they too can contribute to the racism that they need to combat. Right? How would you respond to someone saying to you that making a law or a policy even that is based on Jews as race and discrimination against Jews as race or ethnicity, that might contribute to the problem? And how would you respond to that?
Well, there are.
I'm not saying I would take this position, I'm just curious.
Please,
Zionism is racism.
you'll get to ask your question.
I know, just in a moment, I want to take that in 2 parts. One, there's a question, is there a problem with the effects of defining Jews as a race for this purpose? And I would say yes, and that's why I think the subjective intent is better than the historical approach, because of the ultimate effects that are created when we institutionalize the notion of Jews as a race or Jews as a national origin. But as to the broader question of the potential adverse effects of extending civil rights protections to Jews, I would say that I am not as concerned about that. Looking at, because Jews have had civil rights protections under Title VII in employment, and I don't see a massive backlash as a result of that, nor a massive backlash against blacks because of the protections under the host system. So I don't think it's a problem in general for extending the civil rights protections, but it's a reason to be careful about the foundation of the protection.
Okay. Very briefly.
Was any definitions of race in Title VII in the employment situation helpful for you? And also, did the Supremes at all comment on ethnicity in either the Sherry field or the Arab case?
Well, in the Arab case, St. Francis College, race was defined as ethnic or ancestral characteristics. So essentially, the court knocked down the division between race and national origin, at least implicitly, which I think is correct.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the other part of the question was
whether in the definition of race, would the employment situation in Title VII be helpful?
In terms of the legislative history and of the use of the term race in Title VII, I can't think of anything that's been helpful. I don't know if there's anything you had in mind.
Because I've never done it in Title VI, I've done stuff in Title VII, and it gets heavily into race as definition of whether someone qualifies for protection under that. That's why I was wondering if that would have been useful.
I mean, in general, because there's so much Title VII law and so little Title VI law.
That's why I've asked.
Invariably, when you don't have an answer to Title VI, you go to Title VII. But the thing about Title VII is that religious discrimination is prohibited. So there isn't a need to ask the finely grained questions about race of that sort.
Thanks for the last question.
In light of what was asked before, there was already a United Nations resolution that described Zionism as racism. And in light of what was asked before, I'm afraid of the repercussions of, and again, that resolution of the United Nations was, after a while, was changed, yeah. But I'm afraid that the discussion would yield outcomes that we do not want and we do not seek. This is one thing. I wanted to ask you if there is any chance of amending Title VI and adding religion as one of the criteria for discrimination.
On your first point, I would say that despite the potential of a backlash, there has been enormous value served, for instance, by those who lobbied the European Union Monitoring Committee to develop the working definition of anti-Semitism. And I think that international effort to focus on this aspect of the new anti-Semitism has had far more in the way of positive effects than negative effects. As to your second question, I think that either Title VI should be amended to include religion, or that there should be a new bill to prohibit religious discrimination in education. And I've spoken with different congressional staff. Some have seemed interested, but it hasn't really gotten to the point of any legislation that's been introduced on the floor. But I think there should be.
Okay, and just before I thank you, I just want to make one quick announcement. Next Tuesday we're having a special lecture. It's the William Prusoff honorary lecture. Professor Prusoff is, I'm sure many of you know, is a professor of pharmacology here, and he was one of the first supporters of the idea of GISA. We're having the second annual William Prusoff lecture, and our special guest will be Benny Morris. And it's going to be next Tuesday, the 3rd of February. So it'll be a special event. So I hope you can come and tell people about it. And Ken, thank you very much for coming. I'm sorry.